was in the British Foreign Service. Graduated from Oxford and joined the Foreign Service in 1995. And between 2001 and 2003, he headed up the Islamic Media Unit, the UK's initiative to reach out to opinion makers in the Arab and broader Islamic world, and gave over 200 interviews in Arabic to the Middle East Satellite Service. And he was awarded the, you know, I have to ask, I recognize the BE, the part of the British Empire, but the M is for?
The M is for member, member of the order.
Member of the Order of the British Empire. Okay, good. Thank you. Well, congratulations. In 2000,
it's something, Charlie, that's quite difficult to explain to the Arab audiences, because as soon as you say that you're a member of the Order of the British Empire, it really isn't a great advertisement. Yeah, I'm not even sure it's a great advertisement in America.
Well, we're going to give you great stature for it regardless. But actually, I think that the bulk of his service came in 2005 when he went to Baghdad to be the advisor to the Iraqi Prime Minister. He became head of the British Embassy's political team in Baghdad, and later went to Afghanistan, where he became the head of the political team of the British Embassy in Kabul as well. He then went on an unpaid leave status with the British Foreign Service to enter service with the United Nations as a senior staffer at the United Nations mission in Afghanistan in 2009. So he left that service of the UN to come here in 2009 and take up a fellowship here. So I present Gerard Russell with great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I think I'll stand up to give this so I can make sure of reaching you all. And kick off with a couple of questions. First of all, is any government genuinely capable of having a dialogue with foreign public opinion? Does public diplomacy do any good? And is it right to talk about the Muslim world? From 2001 to 2003, under the direction of Tony Blair and specifically his confidant and spokesman Alistair Campbell, two of whom are up there on the screen looking slightly miserable. It's not the best picture, I have to say. I set up the first initiative of its kind, I think, in the Western world for many years, which was a unit wholly dedicated to improving the image of the UK with Muslims across the world. And I want to take about 10 minutes to describe that project and its context, but then to spend slightly longer than that to explain why, although I think that kind of initiative is valuable, I think we, by which I mean the US, the UK, civil society, and governments, can do better. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the idea of addressing Muslim discontent through the media, which had been proposed before during the 1990s and been turned down, became a priority for Blair and Campbell. And that was first because they had a strong belief that the media could be used to change public opinion. Second, because it was an area where the UK could help the US, using its slightly greater acceptability to audiences in the Muslim world. Third, because Al Jazeera had become so visible and was being exploited by Osama bin Laden for propaganda effect, and the government felt that it should not leave his account of events uncontested. So that's why when I was standing outside a Ramallah restaurant in 2001, October 2001, I had a phone call from the Foreign Office asking me, as they put it then, to be an advisor on Islam. And then I went back to Britain, and that very day I returned, was told that I'd actually have to appear on television in Arabic, having never appeared on television in my life before. I didn't actually tell them that I'd never appeared on television before. But it was pretty nerve-wracking. But within days, there it was. And in November 2001, I was joined on the airwaves by a very senior ambassador from the State Department, Ambassador Christopher Ross. And under the direction of Charlotte Beers, the United States launched a $10 million advertising campaign aimed at Arab audiences and presenting an image of American tolerance towards Muslims. The more modest UK effort, which I ran, was only around £100,000 for the whole year. We focused largely on sending small delegations of senior British Muslims on visits to capitals of majority Muslim countries, and in some small-scale production of pamphlets which were distributed through embassies which listed condemnations of the 9/11 attacks by both Muslim and non-Muslim leaders. And this complemented the core work done by ministers and ambassadors who gave interviews, engaged with civil society, and above all continued their dialogue with national governments. From 2003 onwards, the US maintained a communications hub in London to engage with the Arab media. And from around 2005 onwards, the UK maintained one in Dubai. And I should say London was a particularly important place to engage with the Arab media because it's there that they had really found their home after basically having to move from the Middle East, largely because of the pressure there on freedom of speech. So it's in London that Al Jazeera emerged basically out of the ashes of a BBC project to have an Arabic language station, which the government had declined then to fund. It has, of course, since funded one. So I'll tell you a little bit about what it was like. The main part of my own work was giving interviews and taking part in debates on the Arab satellite media. And very often, you know, I'd try and get myself interviewed when there was something that the UK had done or said which was popular. But, I mean, it's equally important. Do come to the front, because actually I don't think Dr. Hassani is going to come. So, do tell her one of those. Equally important, really, though less pleasant, to go out and explain unpopular views and policies. The one thing to always avoid was giving comments on statements by British ministers. So, very often in news programmes, the questions are actually very polite. Sometimes I even felt that, in a sense, I had a much easier time. And I think the Middle East media basically has a slightly old-fashioned approach, which is more like, if you like, the British media was in the 1950s. Reasonably polite. They give you time to answer, they don't interrupt in the news programmes, which is lucky because my Arabic's not perfect. And very often in the debates what happens is somebody gets very excited and can speak very fluently and with enormous force and, you know, quote poetry actually, which is quite hard to respond to when you're trying to speak in a foreign language. And that's when I think it gets really tricky. I mean, luckily remaining calm is actually quite a good thing. It looks quite good, I think. Because, of course, as soon as, if I got excited, then I would totally lose my ability to communicate. So, the debates were much trickier. I note that Christopher Ross, you know, had the same thought. In fact, I think many of us do. Now, public diplomacy really has its origin in colonialism and war, I'm afraid. I mean, if you look at the birth of the BBC Arabic service in the 30s, the birth of the US Information Service had a predecessor which emerged during World War II. The investment that went into these things enormously increased during war. And that's just a fact of life. So it's no surprise to find that this exercise, which would really have been more effective in peacetime, happened as we approached a war in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And really it's public opinion in majority Muslim countries is and will remain important, not just because of troops being present in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also because it's very likely that a general atmosphere of disapproval of US and UK policies is conducive to the growth of terrorist movements, and that it deters governments in those countries from full cooperation with US and UK policy goals and from liberalisation. The UK and the US were very unpopular in most Muslim majority countries, and between 2001-2003 grew more so. You know, which obviously, you know, means it behoves me to be very modest about what I achieved, since during my time in that job we became substantially less popular. In Zogby's 2002 poll, the United States was unpopular in every Arab population surveyed, even in traditionally pro-American Kuwait. The Pew Project, which was done I think in 2005, found that as few as 1% of Jordanians had a favourable view of the US in 2003. And even in 2008, the Gallup poll found only 4% of Syrians approving of US policies. Those attitudes were not set in stone. Actually, there's an enormous amount of volatility. By 2005, America was enormously more popular in Jordan. It was 21%. So I suppose you could say that's 21 times more popular. And most respondents disliked the US for very specific reasons. They told Gallup it was the US invasion of Iraq. They told Zogby in 2002 it was policy towards Israel. Attitudes weren't knee-jerk anti-Western. France and Germany were popular in the Zogby poll. I think they'd be less popular today, certainly France, because of all the issues around the hijab and the banning of the hijab. And after all, the US 50 years ago and the UK 90 years ago were very popular in the Arab world. So we can see these attitudes are not set in stone. That doesn't mean, of course, that having someone on television just that will change people's attitudes. That would really be an insult to people's intelligence in the Arab countries that we're watching. I mean, a politician in our own countries, after all, would be pretty pleased with him or herself if they managed a 1% swing in public opinions just from talking. But highlighting the policies that might be attractive to those audiences could help the US and UK to mitigate their hostility. So the one thing that I can be sure of is that just being on the programs was viewed positively. That's true of Tony Blair, it's true also, of course, of Barack Obama, who just last year was on Al Arabiya. It's true of our ministers and of our spokespeople. It's a sign that one cares enough. Certainly if you speak the language, it's a sign of having taken an interest, being willing to listen, and also, I think there's a certain catharsis in being there and actually absorbing very often angry comments and questions. My own project was called the Islamic Media Unit, which was really, a spontaneous decision that we took right at the beginning, and I got a lot of complaints about it afterwards. And as I asked at the beginning, is it right to talk about Muslim audiences and the Muslim world? Politicians do attempt to understand how to improve their popularity strategically by devising categories into which the population can be divided. For example, over 50s, young unemployed adults, or whatever. And if religion works as one of those categories, then they'll be very tempted to use it. And Islam did serve that purpose in a couple of ways. First of all, it really is a category for politicians within Britain, where at least 16 members of parliament could lose their seats this May if all their Muslim constituents voted against them. Which is unlikely, because, these categories rarely indicate that you've got actually a swing vote. Muslims don't change their party allegiance on the basis of specific policies, at least not to date. But it certainly pays off for politicians to show respect to their religion through mosque visits, explicit shows of respect for Islam and so forth. If you watch Jack Straw, you'll very often see that he likes to use the phrase inshallah on television. Jack Straw is one of those 60 MPs whose majority does actually depend upon the Muslim vote. Now, although Muslims are not unified on many political standpoints in Britain or outside it, there are a few that come across in the polling data. One of them being that outside of sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't like George Bush or the United States under his leadership. Iraq, Guantanamo and Palestine are also very important to most Muslims across the world, as those surveys also show. So, without presuming any false sense of Muslim unity, it's certainly clear that our policies in 2001 to 3 were hitting some red buttons for a majority of Muslims in the world, and in that context it made sense to make sure they were hearing our point of view. The Al Jazeera channel wasn't just viewed by Arabs, although it was principally, of course. It was watched without necessarily people understanding the dialogue in places like Bangladesh, even in Britain, in fact. And in places like Morocco, not many people could understand the Fusha that's used on Al Jazeera. They were watching it for the pictures. So I'm less sure myself that we should have advertised it explicitly as an initiative aimed at Muslims. First of all, within the UK, initiatives aimed at Muslims have become controversial, and a recent parliamentary report criticised them as stigmatising. I want to get my picture off the screen. Rather, this is great. This is the US, the Charlotte Beers initiative for presenting the US to publics in the Middle East. It was widely panned, I have to say, but anyway, there it is. Now, the language used on the media with the best of intentions within the UK about the Muslim community, for example, can contribute to a sense with which certainly many of my own friends who are Muslim are uncomfortable, which is that they end up being identified by their religion when they might prefer to be identified by ethnic origin, or simply what part of Britain they're from, or what school they went to, and so forth. And, sometimes I'm finding that when you talk to certain people about, you want to talk to them about Islam, and they actually find this very uncomfortable. They don't particularly want to be put into a position just because they come from a certain background of being defined by that identity, which is fair enough because the rest of us don't experience it. And whether for someone in the UK or outside it, defining them by their religion without their consent can be inappropriately intrusive. And I'd argue that that's especially true when it's a belief system and not just a specific ethnic or cultural identity. Now, our initiative was addressed abroad, and it wasn't necessarily seen as intrusive, but the way that we spoke of Muslims as our target audience did risk alienating non-Muslims in the Middle East, for example, some of whom felt just as strongly about the issues we were raising as Muslims did. So perhaps we need terminology that is less intrusive and more inclusive. In respect of Muslims, of engagement with Muslims overseas, we might find a term, and I've never found one that satisfied me. The broader Middle East, maybe there are cultural terms based around Arab, Persian or African identity, for example, that could replace the simple religious one. And that's something where afterwards perhaps people who've thought about this issue more deeply than I have, can raise some suggestions. I also do believe that governments should have relations with the ulama and clergy of Islam. Now, I was called upon in 2006 to improve our dialogue with the Shia clergy in Najaf, and I was lucky to have some friends that could explain to me the particular notes that it's important to strike in dialogue with the clergy. It's a very different business from dealing with governments, and it's not something in which I'd had any training. In fact, it's here at the feet of people like Professor Hassani that I've actually begun for the first time to look at Islam as a religion rather than a political culture. And perhaps it's for this reason that it was as late as 2006 that we put serious effort into beginning a proper dialogue with the Shia hierarchy in Najaf. That we should have done so right at the beginning of 2003. So I support the idea of specifically religious outreach. And as the Chicago Council on Global Affairs proposed in a recent report, this could be outreach to all religions, and not just Islam. In the Foreign Office there are departments for economic affairs, for drugs and organised crime, but none for religion. There is an ambassador to the Vatican, but he reports back to the European department, which normally has its hands full with European Union directives and not with cardinals. So my suggestion would be to have an outreach effort, but to keep it essentially separate from political work and public diplomacy. So that completes my description of our work, and now I want to look at how, in the future, we could do better. Let me do so by taking some examples of rumours and beliefs in Afghanistan which have been damaging for the coalition forces there. Now, a communication effort should be about more than just dispelling rumours. Its most basic objective ought to be to combat, its most basic objective ought to be to combat the most pernicious and tendentious of hostile stories. And if it can combat those stories, then it's likely to succeed in other ways as well. And if it can't, then it's not. Now, rumours of coalition assistance to the Taliban have become common in Afghanistan. They're very damaging. They're damaging to efforts for reconciliation because they make Afghans suspect the motives of the US and UK. They also undermine Afghan active support for the coalition effort because when Afghans suspect us of ulterior motives, they're less likely to risk their lives to help us. In April 2008, some weapons were accidentally dropped in the wrong location and ended up in Taliban hands. Some Afghan parliamentarians claimed, whoops, that's the wrong one. I don't have that one. Or perhaps this is the one. This is the one, sorry. Some Afghan parliamentarians claimed it was deliberate, so hence the headline. From May to October 2009, rumours circulated of coalition forces helping to fly Taliban around the country. So in October last year, President Hamid Karzai said that information from local residents and officials had indicated that unmarked helicopters were ferrying militants to Baghlan, Kunduz and Samangan province and had been airdropping them at night. And he said, even today, we received reports that the furtive process is still ongoing, saying the evidence was too sensitive to share. He then added that authorities had received similar reports in the northwest as well, and were investigating whether increasing security in the north is linked to this. Iranian TV, which is press TV, had its own spin on this. This is a special thing that they did to take revenge on us for doing a Farsi service. A third example is the rumour that sparked protests in October 2009 that US troops had burned a Quran in Wardak province. Now ISAF denied the report, but clearly some people believed it, as we see here. So why do people believe these stories, and how can they be stopped? I want to give some examples of why people believe rumours that are drawn from experiments and studies done in the United States. There was a study done in 1973 which showed that children who tended normally to be more anxious than their peers were about 2.5 times more likely than them to spread rumours. Stressed people, in fact, are more likely to jump to conclusions when faced with ambiguous situations. And I would suggest that that is clearly valid for Iraq and Afghanistan. It's so in Iraq that nearly 1,000 deaths were caused on a bridge in Baghdad when a rumour spread that there was a suicide bomber, and there was an enormous rush for a very small exit, and a lot of people were killed, were drowned or crushed in the melee. And that's an example of how people who are already worried, who've lived with a year or so of bombardment of attacks by suicide bombers, are very susceptible to rumours. And I want to give an example here which helps a bit, helps justify this comparison, which you may think is rather doubtful, between the USA and Afghanistan. So let me give you an example of the similarity of human behaviour in these two very different countries. Now in May 2009, a scare story swept Afghanistan of Taliban poison gas attacks on schoolgirls in Kapisa. Girls said they had been sprayed with poison and were taken unconscious or vomiting off to hospital. Staff and others said they had seen nothing, but the incidents kept happening in one school after another. Now, without presuming much about the truth of that, there was an incident in 1944 in Mattoon in Illinois, where one family after another claimed they had been gassed by an unseen person through the windows of their houses. Symptoms were of vomiting and paralysis. The story of the anesthetic prowler spread, and more victims came forward. Whoops, we've lost contact there again. Now, all port and postmen, trying to get this to go backwards. No, perhaps not. All port and postmen in research carried out in the 1940s concluded that rumours were also likely to be passed on in a form that is more in accordance with the presuppositions and interests of the person who is retelling them. So when a rumour is familiar, it is more credible. And balanced information doesn't necessarily change this pattern. So in an experiment in 2004, they presented a group of Republicans and a group of Democrats with the same information about the existence or otherwise of WMD in Iraq. And afterwards, what you found was the Republicans were even more convinced that the WMD existed, the Democrats even more convinced that it didn't. They had read the same information. The experiment concluded people take from what they read the information that justifies the beliefs that they already had. Furthermore, they tend, when gathered in groups of vaguely like-minded people, to hold their opinions more strongly and even to become more extreme. French people, when gathering together to discuss United States policy, always ended up more hostile to the United States afterwards. Even individuals in such a group who are inclined to disagree will probably conform with the majority. There's an amazing experiment done by a man called Solomon Asch. He took a line, and then he shows people 3 lines, one of which, is exactly the same length as the first one that they saw. And he asks the group to say which of these lines is the same length as the one you saw earlier, and asked individually, everyone will say the right answer. But when you put them in a group where every person but one is saying the wrong answer, that last person will very often also give the wrong answer, even though they can see quite clearly that it's untrue. I mean, it's obvious. It's 2 lines on the paper. You can't get it wrong, really. Very intriguingly. And basically, quite often, they did it because they didn't want to disagree with the majority. So, that's why I think I got up here the idea of groupthink and of bellwethers, particular individuals who can be very influential in spreading a rumour or persuading the group of a truth of a belief. In addition, rumours are often favoured because they tap into collective emotions, which is why you find that when a rumour spreads of a horrific event, usually it's a sort of finger in a baked beans can or whatever it'll be, the kind of thing. Canned beef, I think it usually is. The story will get more and more horrific with the telling.
Well, that's why only in British canned beef.
Yes, wouldn't happen. Now that evidence does fit with some of the rumours that we've looked at in Afghanistan. Now, Quran burnings do fit with a preconceived idea that non-Muslims are likely to disrespect Islam. Claims of Taliban landings and arms drops fit with Afghan recollections of British and US help for Pakistan-funded jihadi groups in the 1980s. Religious leaders could be the bellwethers that help to spread the rumours of Quran burnings. Sometimes that happens in sermons. President Karzai in the case of the Taliban rumour. Now the last criterion on that list, well, I've got ambiguity. I thought I'd skip that because I will save a bit of time. The last criterion on that list isn't drawn from the studies on rumour, but it's drawn from a work of a lady called Terry Ann Knopf. In 1973, who looked at the beliefs held by black Americans in areas where there had been race riots. And one of the core beliefs that they had is that the system is forever conspiring against blacks. And I'd like us to hold on to the thought, even though this one is only my own, that something in common, perhaps, between black Americans at that time and Jordanians, Pakistanis and others today is that they feel very distanced from those who have power over them, both Western governments and their own, they're unlikely to have first-hand experience of what the people who run those governments are like. And I mean, if we think about it, why do we disbelieve conspiracy theories? I think it'll often be because we feel that we know something about the people who might be involved in such a conspiracy. Like, I mean, you think about whether you know people in government. Certainly that would be my response. You think, well, that person wouldn't possibly be able to arrange a conspiracy, or that person wouldn't really want to. Now, building on that theme, let's look at some of the guidelines they had in Boston in World War II to fight defeatist rulers. And what we see there is a great emphasis on developing faith, confidence, and authority. The Middle East is a great haven for conspiracy theories. There's even a suggestion by a gentleman called Sunstein and Vermeulen in the Harvard Law Review that it's due to a crippled epistemology relying upon limited sources of information because of the relative absence of civil liberties and a well-functioning marketplace of ideas. But this isn't very likely. The now very sophisticated satellite media in the Arab world does provide a range of information. You have Israeli, US and UK spokespeople in evidence. There's plenty of information on the internet. Plenty of information in the USA in the 1960s. But the issue was whether people trusted that information. This is an epistemological gap. It's partly about trust. It's partly about isolation. For example, in certain societies where contact with foreigners is very limited. It's also about the experience of people in those countries and how different it is from our own. When we look at conspiracy theories in the Middle East, we ought to start perhaps with a recognition they have often been true. Britain and France really did secretly conspire to carve out the Middle East in World War I. The British really did cunningly conspire to bring the Pashtuns of the northwest frontier province into Pakistan. R.F. Carrot describes it with some pride in his autobiography. There was a conspiracy by France, Britain and Israel to invade Egypt in 1956. There was a conspiracy to remove Mossadegh in Iran and return the Shah, and so forth and so on. So all of these things were denied at the time by all government sources, at the end of which we have a crisis of trust. Not really helped, of course, by the fact that when I was out there talking about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, we have a new, basically, a new myth, if you like, to add to that list. To make things worse, in a less information-rich environment, stories and rumours are remembered for longer. So Afghans, Iraqis and others do expect us to behave, sometimes, as we did 30 or 50 years ago, and their memories of that time are more vivid. At least it always seems so to me. So just as Americans were more inclined to believe in conspiracy theories about President Kennedy after the Watergate scandal, had sapped their belief that such things couldn't happen in America, and had undermined their belief in the official news media, so we shall see that Arabs and Afghans are arguably more open to conspiracy theories, which are false because they don't trust us to tell them the truth. So in that light, there are a few ideas. Let me run through. These are ideas from Sunstein and Vermeulen for how to fight conspiracy theories. And I don't think any of these ideas are specifically going to be useful in our case. You can see that 3 and 5 are kind of what we do. I don't think banning things is going to help. Option 4, which is paying people to go out and deny hostile stories, is what the Lincoln Group did in 2006, when it said it had been paid by the US government to bribe Iraqi newspaper editors, or at least to pay for the placement of stories that were favourable to the US. The idea was that if there was a visible US source for the story, it would be less credible. Having them in a newspaper without a source made them more credible. Now, that was true, of course, except that when the newspapers ran the stories, they lost credibility, because the reason those stories weren't being run for free by the editors was because they made bad copy, meaning that they were either irrelevant or unbelievable. Now, Sunstein and Vermeulen go on to say something which I think is more useful, which is, in general, in order to enhance its credibility with antecedently sceptical Muslim audiences, the US government must go a long way towards surrendering control over the content of its speech. And they go on to add, however, domestic political constraints may preclude whatever mix of credibility and control is optimal from the standpoint of dampening conspiracy theories or promoting US public relations goals more generally. And I think that's a very important thought. Now, there's a video which has come out yesterday, which is, I'm not going to show it, although I do have it here, which shows a US combat helicopter engaging with what they believe to be insurgents. And actually, basically, 2 of them are journalists. Who the others were is not clear, but there's nothing on the video to prove that they were insurgents. And this video, the point I want to make about it is this, that Iraqis on the ground know that that kind of thing can happen. I I mean, I knew a person, for example, in 2003, I went around, I met a lot of people who were opponents of Saddam who wanted to go out to Iraq and take part in the reconstruction. And these were Iraqis. And one of them, I remember, a very keen person, but in his early 20s. And when I saw him in 2005, when I went to Iraq, he was in a wheelchair, and that's because he had driven too close to a US checkpoint. He'd been shot 5 times. And this kind of thing is pretty familiar. It's pretty well known to Iraqis on the ground. And by withholding things like this video, which shows, whatever it shows, what happens is that we create a gap between what we see in Europe and America and what Iraqis and sometimes it's Afghans who see it on the ground. Which means that we don't actually address their concerns because we're not even aware of them. We're not internalizing them as we would do if these things had become public in the US. And now that it is public here, I think we'll see a much more lively debate. My suggestion would be the kind of debate which will now happen about these incidents is the kind of debate which will be useful in persuading Iraqis of what really happened and why such incidents happened. For example, it may help to dispel the idea that journalists are killed because they're journalists. I think that becomes clear from the video that that's not what happened. And my suggestion is that actually concealing and dampening the debate within America may serve whatever purpose it serves, but it certainly doesn't serve the objective of persuading people out in Iraq and Afghanistan that we've got answers to the questions they're asking. We're not answering their questions at all because the questions are not being asked in our own societies. So let me give you some proposals to begin the discussion. First of all, I do feel the US, the UK governments, ISAF, should be active in communicating with audiences and media in all theatres where they operate. If only because silence can be interpreted as consent, and a convincing rebuttal will change some minds, and because once a rumour is established, as we saw earlier, it gives credence to future rumours. And this effort should be in peacetime, even more than in wartime. Now, I'll give up on this. I had a picture of President Obama on Al Arabiya, but I'm sure you can imagine it. Basically just to say what a good thing to have done. It's towards the end. Never mind. Sorry, that's just another example of the same problem. There we are. But there should be transparency, because denying stories that are true, and which every Iraqi and Afghan knows are true, means that when the false stories come along, they're very hard to dispel. And they should have tolerance for those who accept or even propagate stories they dislike, even if they think them false, provided those people are open to reasoned argument. In addition, I propose there should be some trusted arbiter of the truth, an agency independent of the US, perhaps something on a global scale, rather like the Press Complaints Commission in the UK. I'm not sure what you have here. Press Complaints Commission in the UK doesn't have legal authority to impose its views, but it looks with what's meant to be an objective viewpoint at complaints from either side and rules dispassionately on them. So it could be an authoritative voice which could dismiss, for example, allegations that ISAF is secretly conspiring with the Taliban, while at the same time, no doubt, it would also sometimes endorse stories, or say that they're valid, or say that they are legitimate accusations, if you like, which we may not like. But nonetheless, as sometimes it's been proven, the UN, for example, in 2008 alleged that ISAF had killed a number of civilians in Shindand. ISAF vehemently rejected the accusation and then discovered that there was basically a lot of truth to it. An example again of how things that can seem very tricky, objectionable, I'm sure as a spokesman I would have been very much inclined to go out there and deny it. Nonetheless, you can be tripped up afterwards. And that's why it's important to go beyond the government voice, to have authoritative, independent sources of information. Let me add 2 more thoughts. One is that in respect of the Muslim world, which I'm now going to put in inverted commas, I'd like to highlight the opportunity that I think the creation of a new European diplomatic service gives us. Now this is a tricky subject. It's awkward to tell what the future of European relations will be with the Middle East. Europe was very popular with Muslims in 2003. That probably will now turn about the other way for various reasons, not least President Obama. But over the decades, you can expect Europe to invest more in its relations with the Middle East and other majority Muslim countries than the United States will do. At least, that's an argument. Because of geographical contiguity, because of the expansion of Europe, because of increasing migration. That may not mean less tension, but it should mean more cultural understanding and influence. Lastly, with regard to this domestic issue, which the Parliament has criticised, of how the UK should interact with its own Muslim population. My suggestion, which may apply to the USA as well, maybe, I don't know, would be that what we need to encourage is enfranchisement. Largely speaking, back in 2001, looking around for people who were prominent Muslims in Britain, it was quite difficult to find, particularly elected people who could fulfil that role. We had two, I think, in Parliament at the time. And there wasn't much interest, particularly Arabs in Britain, particularly not interested in politics. So my suggestion would be that there should be a fund to provide scholarships in democratic political activism to communities which are underrepresented in elected institutions. They needn't necessarily be Muslims, but while not singling out Muslims as a group, we'd need to identify such communities based on religion and not just ethnicity to make sure that Muslims, being of various different races, are not collectively underrepresented. I think, Charlie, that was well over time.
Well, I thank you, Gerard, for a very thoughtful and well-prepared presentation. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and begin teasing out a couple of things that you've said. In the beginning, you said improve the image of American tolerance toward Muslims, and then later you said improve the image of the UK in the Arab or Muslim world. I forget which term you used. You know, language is a tricky thing, but improving the image kind of means public relations rather than maybe substantive. So I realize that you were in government service, but was your job to kind of truth tell or to soothe, in a manner of speaking?
I think that's a very good question. I think the approach, I think it would be true, and not just special pleading, to say that the US took the approach more soothing. I mean, the issues which they addressed basically in this advertising campaign, which, as far as it went, was a good advertising campaign. It was done by a brilliant, advertising executive. So the problem wasn't the quality of the campaign, which, is miles back, and I'll get stuck on this thing if I try and find it. But basically, they had a lot of evidence in those commercials that the US was a nice place to live. Basically that didn't engage with the substantive issues which were of concern, because that's not the issue. It's perfectly plain that people believe the US is a nice place to live because they come and live here, so it's not the problem. I think we were slightly more focused on engaging with the genuine issues. Although that's an instinct, it's not based necessarily on evidence. Christopher Ross was out there, and Nabil Khouri, who succeeded him, was out there as US spokespeople, having a very hard time, particularly Nabil, because he was himself of Arab origin, got accused a lot of nasty stuff for having adopted the US line. But my feeling is they engaged with the issues, and I think that was the right thing to do. And I think that the advertising campaign was a waste of money, because it engaged in mood music, which really wasn't needed.
Good. Well, thank you for your direct and honest answer. And one last question. It was called the Islamic Media Unit. Were the programs that were done there translated into Swahili or Indonesian languages that could reach large numbers of Muslims, or was it kind of related to the Arab world more?
Well, what we did was this. Because of the Arab media being in London, I did a lot of engagement with the Arab media specifically, and that was my background. We did have an Urdu speaker in the unit as well, and he did some interviews that were aimed abroad and some that were aimed domestically. In Britain, unlike America, there isn't a rigid division between what the Foreign Office, the Foreign Office is allowed to do some work within Britain, whereas the State Department is strictly prohibited from doing work within America. So we did do some of that, but my view was the embassies are a much better place to do that. The ambassadors have much more experience of those individual countries and what they're interested in, which was not always the same issues. Some of them were common, some of them were not. If you look at Iran, for example, what do Iranians say in 2003 they really wanted from America? It wasn't generally political. It was actually economic and technical assistance. That meant that I was very wary of trespassing on that turf. The only thing that we did as a service for embassies in the Arab world was that we engaged from London with the Arab media. So, in other words, I'd like to think that overall we touched all the bases collectively, but I didn't get deeply involved in Indonesia and so forth, except in the sense that we sometimes sent out British Muslims. Now, you could say that that was kind of mood music, because that was really about the position of Muslims within Britain, just as Charlotte Pierce's campaign was about the position of Muslims in America.
Well, thank you. Let me invite questions. We like questions to end with a question, but you can certainly make a couple of brief statements before that if you want to frame your question first. And let's treat everyone with respect. So,
Thank you, Gerard, for being involved in such a complicated
and maybe you could actually identify yourself for the rest of the audience, because some of us know who each other are and some of us don't.
I'm Rima. I'm a fellow at the Carr Center.
And you're from?
I'm from Lebanon. Gerard, I looked with fear and alarm at the new initiative by the, I think it's at the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations, to engage with religious communities in the Arab world. And the reason we look at this with fear and alarm is because we fear at a moment where we want our societies to become more secular, that by actually engaging with religious leaders, you're putting them again as a center of power. And not only that, we fear that this will be used by the US to fulfill its own political agendas, which in fact will end up in more sectarianism in a world, in a region that is plagued by sectarianism. So I would like you to comment on that. What are your thoughts on that going forward? And just for people who don't know, just to fill you in with a little bit of background, Al-Arabiya is actually known in the region to be, supportive of the U.S. So whereas it might be a great thing for Obama to be on Al-Arabiya, he's not reaching out to people who are against the U.S. He's actually appealing to an audience that is already, more supportive of the U.S. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Rima. Those are great questions. Let me take the second one first, because it's slightly easier. I agree. I think he should do a follow-up on Al Jazeera. And that's what Tony Blair did in 2001. And I think it was the right decision. He did this a lot, though, and he had this kind of masochism strategy, which was going out to the most hostile audiences in Britain about the Iraq War and just standing there and taking it. And so I think there's several things play into this. I'm sure that, for example, there are some Arab governments and leaders who would be keen to see engagement with Al-Arabiya and rather suspicious of Al Jazeera, that on top of the fact that America might perceive Al-Arabiya as more favourable. But I agree with you. I think the point is to go beyond those who are on your side, to reach out to people who are not. The first question is really tricky. I'm sort of inclined to think, I do believe that we need to understand religious leaders in the Middle East better. And I say that because I think, for example, that Iyad Allawi made a fundamental mistake in his time as previous time as Prime Minister, of Iraq, that he did not engage with Sistani, and that he essentially seems to have failed to understand the extent to which the religious hierarchy could mobilize. And I think that lost him the election. Well, it clearly did. Britain and the US, I would say, along with Allawi, failed to realise, I know they, or at least that Britain failed to realise how significant Sistani was going to be. So I think mistakes like that, we have to rectify them in our own interest. And that it's important perhaps then to separate out that aspect of our work from the political work. And maybe that can be done by having a separate department that looks at religious affairs, that is different from the one that looks at policy. Because, as I say, I don't think you can get around the fact that many of these religious leaders are very important. It's not, the fundamental interest of Britain is its interests, and its welfare or the progress or the direction of the Arab world is something that Arabs need to choose for themselves, and foreign countries that must respond to it and reflect it. So I don't think we can cut off that trend towards greater understanding of religious figures. I do agree with you that we need to be very careful about it, and I wish there was a new terminology that we could use so that we didn't continually talk about the Muslim world and Muslim audiences, because I think, as I say, it's both exclusive and intrusive.
Ali Hassani, Study of Religion and Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Very interesting talk. I think the issue that comes up in my mind is the broader issue that of what I would call think one of the things that plagues societies at a global level, it's not just a peculiarly Western issue, but I think for many Muslim societies as well, is how people think about religion. Very often, I mean, in this notion of singling out people by their religious identity, it's a way of thinking about religion that I think dehumanizes. So for instance, if you think about a Muslim just on the basis of their religion, you're stripping them of all other contexts, political, economic, social, and so on, which you wouldn't do to somebody in your own, you know. So I think that that's a very dangerous phenomenon, because that dehumanization that takes place, and it's based on a particular understanding of religion. Religion is rites, ritual ceremonies, or religion is what's on text. But thinking about religion in more complex ways, that religion is actually a cultural phenomenon that is deeply embedded in a variety of contexts, political, economic, social, literary, culture, and that as these contexts change and evolve, people's interpretation of religion changes. It's something dynamic. It grows and it interacts in very dynamic ways. And my sense is that even though there is a foreign policy circles, both in the US and UK, a recognition, okay, we need to know who the Shia are, we need to know what is their basis and so on. But it's based on a notion of religion, which I think unfortunately is very shallow as to the true nature of religion. And I think it also reflected in our curricula, in our schools, and so on. It's a much, much broader problem. So the question that I had for you is that in terms of outreach to the quote-unquote Muslim world, and it's a problem to talk about Muslim world because Britain is part of the Muslim world. The United States is part of the Muslim world, if you define Muslim world wherever Muslims live. Is this issue about when countries like Britain and UK, which have Muslim populations and are part of the Muslim front, what they're doing in terms of actually encouraging better understanding about religion within their own society, so to come to terms with pluralism. Because I think one of the issues that comes up over and over again is when you have right-wing groups that sort of will say, okay, Muslims are not American, or Muslims...
Sort of actually reply to both those points, because I should say, I mean, Sir John is a retired ambassador of immense stature. He's very modest and doesn't mention it, but retired ambassadors, oddly enough, Sir John, were precisely the kind of people that we tried to get to say things on television that we can never say ourselves for the reasons that you outline. That you cannot, as a spokesman, you can't say things your government won't like. You need to be careful what you say will not be reproduced in your home country in a way that embarrasses you. Alberto Gonzalez, who was the spokesman for the USA in 2005, said that the US, in the course of a long interview, most of which he very ably defended the US position, said, there's been no doubt there has been US arrogance and stupidity in the American approach in Iraq. And he got, put on the rack for that. Most people, of course, in the Middle East thought it was a pretty mild comment compared to what they thought. And I've no doubt that it enhanced his credibility, but it enormously damaged him back home. And I, would never have dared to say anything like it. So I think that does hold one back, and it's why people outside government are more credible, and why indeed places academia has an important role, because academics can reach across that gap more effectively than governments can. And Jeet, I don't have an easy answer. I mean, the evidence is that if you look at, again, the polling, and people are asked to choose in the Middle East between these slightly crude categorizations. Do you define yourself as an Arab or a Muslim, or as, for example, Lebanese or Sudanese or Egyptian, when you meet an American or when you meet another Arab? The proportion is slowly going up of those who identify primarily as Muslims. Which is to say that the categories are not entirely unrecognized in the region itself. Certainly the category of Arab is not a problematic one. I think very few. I don't think it's intrusive any more than other categories we use, which are essentially ethnic. I don't think it's exclusive. I don't think people, apart from the Kurds, I think it covers most people feel comfortable. Egyptians sometimes don't like it, but you know, it's not. Nobody's going to come to you and say, look, you are explicitly excluding me. What I don't see is that we have something that, because I don't think people can avoid using terms, particularly, you know, strategic thinkers, politicians. Just look at the way that the phrase "the Muslim world" has become so popular. And I feel that we're going to need to find one, but that perhaps if we can find one that's better, it needs to go beyond Arab, because there are several ways in which, for example, well, I think there are several ways in which you can say that audiences in Afghanistan, for example, in Pakistan, are sharing some of the perspectives of the Arab world. But I think we're agreeing that it shouldn't be just to say Muslim. Anyway, that doesn't really cover the fact that in Malaysia and Indonesia you've got a slightly different audience, in Iran you've got a different audience. So it's not even accurate, as well as the problems we've identified. But I think we're going to need a category. I just don't know quite what the phrase is.
My name is Saleh. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm Palestinian. I used to work for USAID. And USAID had its outreach program as well within the Palestinian territories. And the problem was not lack of knowledge, because I was a local staff. There was many local staff who were giving them. There was a problem that our counterparts on the Palestinian side were the most corrupt people, that the State Department insisted on channeling all the outreach money through them. Even though everybody knew and everybody said back to their officers, these people are, everybody in the society knows they're extremely corrupt and they're not going to be an efficient mechanism to channel your resources through. But at the end, the USAID guy who had the money to spend got the instructions from the State Department, from Washington, from people who never been on the ground, didn't understand. And all the local staff, like, complaints were never really addressed. And I always wondered why. You know, why, if you want to spend, and if you're really sincere in getting your point through, why do you spend all these resources through the most corrupt people that you know that will never achieve anything?
It's a very good question, Sonia. And they were government people, or you're meaning they were NGOs?
NGOs and government, both. I mean, I remember one time that the US political officer once said it and never said it again. He said, like, she said, she was late, she said, I don't want to see more BMWs parked outside. And so they knew, but why to insist on spending on through certain people that will not give you your message?
The only thought that I can give you on that, I think basically you could almost call it an inefficient market. I mean, a politician, when they're reaching their own audience domestically, will be much more careful, because basically they've got a lot at stake. And what's more, they'll know pretty quickly if they're using the wrong people to reach out to their audiences. Beyond the fact that there's a big structure that's set up and it exists and it carries on for ages. Which is really why I think we've struggled and we've been very inefficient in reaching out to, and here we go again, Muslim audiences in Britain. Because we don't have that many in Parliament. And that's why I think to have people in Parliament who are elected by everyone, not just by Muslims, is a much better system. It's healthier, it's better, because it's efficient. In other words, those people, if they're popular, they'll be re-elected. If they're unpopular, they won't be. That means they care about what people think about them. Now, our problem, and why governments are fundamentally inefficient at the business of selling themselves abroad, to put it crudely, is that they hardly even register how successful they're being. I mean, you know, would they even know? Apart from polls, which I'm not going to judge myself by the terrible decline in British popularity between 2001 and 2003, because it was obviously because of the Iraq War. So mega events are determining popularity, and it's really difficult to tell, or basically it's not scientifically done, it's not tested how effective our outreach efforts are. It could be tested actually, but it's not really done. And it's easy enough to escape with that because governments are not really, they don't care deeply enough. Which is, I think, another reason, it's a slightly depressing conclusion, but it's another reason why I think state and government just don't do this job very well. Some ambassadors can do it really well, based in the country, based there for years. Governments in general are poor at it. And I think that's why we need to look at alternatives.
I think part of the answer could be too that my experience is that programs often have large amounts of money they want to disperse quickly because they're trying to achieve some objective, and when they do that, they tend to choose the contractor class, you might call them, the people who know how to respond to USAID or know how to respond to requests for proposals. Those people become privileged because they understand how to maneuver the system, and I think you find that in Washington, D.C. I mean, they're called Beltway bandits, but they are contractors who may be honest, but they also know how to work the system very well, and I think they're advantaged to some extent because they have that knowledge base. Yes, please.
In addition to that, in Washington a couple of weeks ago, a colleague of mine, in the Afghan effort for the last 8 years, said there is now a study, and of the billions of US dollars that have gone to Afghanistan, fully 40 to 45% is missing. And that's not Afghan corruption, that is contractors. Thank you. That's bad.
How do you see the difference? Alawi didn't reach out.
Maybe you could introduce
I'm
yourself.
sorry. Roger Whalen of Santa Barbara, California. In the first election, or I guess maybe even after he was president, Alawi didn't reach out to Sistani. I don't think anybody knew how powerful he was. Now seemingly responsible he seems to be in comparison to some of the other leaders like al-Sadr. Maliki went after al-Sadr, so it's not likely al-Sadr is going to coalesce with the Maliki faction. How do you see all of that playing out? Will Sistani play a role, and will Alawi be able to get the, whatever it is, the 216 or so votes?
It's a very good question. I'm not going to pretend to know the answer particularly well, but let me just give a couple of comments in response. The first is that it worries me somewhat. Maybe I'm just being pessimistic. I'm somewhat worried. I spent 6 months in the Iraqi government, and it was specifically an Iraqi Shia environment, and I was the only person in it who wasn't both Iraqi and Shia. And I know the strength of feeling there is about the Ba'ath Party. And Alawi was a member of that party, and he's supported largely by Sunni votes. You know, I know I'm using the sectarian terms, but unfortunately it's a reality that one sometimes needs to engage with. And it alarms me slightly. I hope very much that he will be effective at reassuring a significant sector of that population of Shia who don't trust him, that he is someone they can trust. Otherwise,
so far he's made some headway, from what I read.
well, I suppose he may have done, but he hasn't made a huge amount of headway, or else he'd have eaten much more into Maliki's vote. And Maliki came from almost nowhere a few years ago. Dawa was tiny, and he's done pretty well. And he's managed to tackle Southern, who was a huge force, or perceived as a huge force in politics in 2005. He's managed to do that pretty effectively. Now, there's definitely a destabilizing. There's a new political equilibrium that will come into being. The old one is past. In the meantime, I think we're going to have some trouble, because there will be a lot of jittery people. I'm intrigued that the attacks so far have actually been on Shia bicycles. What I would be worried about is a recurrence of the kind of gang warfare where Shia take it into their own hands. Now, Sistani can play an enormous role in that. I'm not sure that he has yet, but no doubt he can. And I hope... Alawi is certainly more sensitive to that point. I don't actually know what Sistani will think. Probably he'd be worried about the same phenomenon of sectarian warfare, and would therefore be very keen, whoever takes over in government, to try and achieve some stability. But you know, maybe I'm wrong. I have been out of there for several years. I could be wrong. I'm just a little bit alarmed as I look at what may be an unstable period.
Did Alawi have a reputation for being, you might have a feeling for this too, also corrupt, or did he have a more pristine reputation when he was president?
had a reputation for being corrupt.
Totally.
What is your
He had a reputation for being corrupt, but so did a lot of people. He wasn't the worst. He wasn't the person that people refer to. There were several people in his government who got into a lot of. There were a lot of allegations about them. The defence minister. It's all very political. The truth is sometimes hard to tell. There are a lot of allegations against people in Malika's government as well. The thing I think to worry about more is actually the issue of whether he's seen by, whether there are now people who have an interest in destabilising things, because there are certain new feelings of fear that can be exploited.
Diana Rowan, founder of Afghan Women Connect in 2001. We support Afghan women NGO leaders on the ground, health and education, also Afghan women lawyers and judges, and women lawyers doing research on tribal customs that would harm and destroy women and girls, the so-called honor killing, etc. Leads into my question. We're also working with the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, the State Department, an effort to reach out. We have a big new media project that speaks to your wonderful information today, your experience, to try to get more journalist training for Afghan women to tell their stories in a professional way in all media, and also how do we reach the Western media to report more thoughtfully, intelligently, and thoroughly on the real issues, not just the very real tragedies, but the sensationalism. We have a bit of American, the coalition public relations crisis on our hands, as we know. Yesterday, New York Times, all of the media. General Petraeus, every time he speaks, we seek to be first with the truth. And now we have this issue of the women who were killed, and Western forces literally took the bullets out in them up and bound them, making it look like a so-called killing. Our media project is coming along. What can be done? What would you do in this situation? Do you know of any way except to admit this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. First of all, I think training of journalists is a wonderful thing to do and very important. Very important for both reasons, both to reach into the Afghan community and back here, to expose truth and have a, close that epistemological gap, if I can use such a sort of slightly odd term. Anyway, I think there isn't. I mean, what's right is that there should be a debate, because for every incident of that kind that comes to our attention, there will have been incidents of which only Afghans know, and we will not believe them. And they will believe each other. And even when they're false, they'll believe each other. So it's very important to have that discussion, because incidents like this do happen. I mean, in Iraq, that awful incident of the woman who was raped and killed and so on. Now, people are unaware of these things in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we encounter those stories and we say, no, it's right. I mean, the stories alleging rape of Iraqi women began with fiction. As soon as the war began, there was a fictional spoof story went around like a virus. But then ended up being true, which means that you have an enormous problem, because unless we open entirely and just say, look, it's true, here's why it happened, here's what we're doing about it, then you just end up not being able to convincingly refute all of the hoaxes. There'll be loads of hoaxes, which will build upon people's sense of fear, that will build upon their ambiguity, the tendency of people to believe rumours in times of crisis. But I think the helicopter footage, I think it's good that it came out. Maybe there's something I haven't spotted in there that puts people in danger or whatever it would be. On the whole, I think it's important to be candid about these things. And I can't think of any other solution, because the truth is, in war, horrible things will happen, because you put a lot of people into a scenario where they're very frightened, there's not always proper controls. Controls will always fail. Human beings are human beings, and terrible things will happen. The only important thing is never to hush them up, because it just does more harm than good.
We have time for one short question, and then we'll give you the last word, sir.
Thank you, Judge Schwartz and Somerville. I was wondering whether you think that there's a sort of singular lack of understanding being demonstrated by by the United States in this, the charges of corruption regarding President Karzai. Because I mean, the question is, do you agree or not that somehow pre-capitalist and post-capitalist, relatively pre- and post-capitalist societies have a sort of built-in tendency toward corruption as a normal way of doing business, in part because in the pre-capitalist, like Afghanistan and to a certain extent Iraq, and maybe even Iran too, you have a dearth of banks. I mean, literally a dearth of physical banks, and I mean, monetary banks. So that if you give somebody some money, where are they going to put it? You know, if they put it in their pocket, they're prime target for robbery. If they put it, and they can't put it in a bank because the bank, you know, maybe there's a bank in Kabul, a couple of banks in Kabul, but maybe not in Marja or Kandahar. I mean, I had a conversation with Dave Dapis, who some of you is joined in conversation here. There's an email conversation, and he said, "There's no way they're going to put banks into Afghanistan because it's too risky." But maybe, I mean, if we reconceptualize changed from this sort of blanket goal of nation building to a more specific goal of capitalism building.
Well, it's a really good question. It's absolutely true, up to a point. I mean, it's certainly true that, for example, police salaries used to be paid in cash. They used to be given basically to the commander to distribute to his people. Not always would that money reach anyone. It disappears along the way. Who can tell who's taken it? You can't tell because you haven't got any financial accounting trail. Actually, the Taliban managed a relatively corruption-free system without any banks at all. So it can be done. Furthermore, they're gradually instituting not just banks, but also a system of electronic transfer of funds. So there are solutions. Corruption is a very tricky issue. There are aspects, there are forms of corruption which have to be fought. They're not inevitable. They didn't happen under the Taliban, and they're very, very dangerous. There are some forms of what we see as corruption which will take a long time to fight because they are exactly in that area where you can't see quite where the money goes. There's a tax being raised, but there's no accounting trail. A lot of people will say, maybe truly, that they don't know how to do the accounts, and then it can be really hard. There are a lot of very complex rules which not everybody understands how to respond to. All of that's true, although I don't want to lose sight of the fact that I think corruption of one of the most serious kind, abuse of power, is really at the root of what's caused all our problems in Afghanistan. The abuse of power by the police, the kidnapping of children, the warlords being able to kill people and get away with it, prisoners being released for the payment of money, people who need to pay bribes in court to get their land back, a lot of things that are causing immense trouble and grievance that are basically fodder for the Taliban.
Gerard, let me thank you. Let me thank all of you. There's some question about whether he will go on to study someplace or go back in the British Foreign Service. I think your role of diplomacy would be better off if you were to rejoin it. But we wish you well in whatever you choose to do. And thank you all for attending today.